So Lawrence got the CG, General Geddes, on the horn and said we needed some riflemen to put on the ground. And it didn't take him very long to decide that he would give us 2 infantry companies, Bravo 2nd of the 1st and Bravo 2nd of the 4th of the 21st. But he told us we had to find a place for them to land. So we're flying around in the C&C ship looking for a suitable landing zone that was close enough to the fight that they would be effective, but not so close that they'd all be killed getting there. Unfortunately, there wasn't such a place, so we had both companies land behind our positions and then marry up with our A Troop and C Troop. We continued doing a racetrack pattern around the fight, marking targets, calling in airstrikes, and generally trying to control the battle, getting the infantry and our guys married up. And A Troop had a track hit by an RPG and had several casualties. And Dustoff said that they were at least 20 minutes away, maybe more. So Colonel Lawrence decided we'd go get them. And we started down. The troop was kind enough to put 2 ACAVs in sort of a V-shaped formation between us and the landing zone that they had prepared. And Denny DeWine, the aircraft commander, set the aircraft down in that spot. There were 6 guys that needed to be medevaced, and a couple of them were hurt pretty bad. There were 7 of us already on the airplane, so we loaded them up, and Denny said, I don't think I'm going to get this thing off the ground. But he did. He backed it up into the bamboo, actually, and then took off over the top of the ACAVs, and that took us right over the top of the NVA positions. So we're all hanging out the door, shooting and carrying on like crazy people. And he got us all out of there, which was an amazing feat. We got the casualties back to the 2nd evac hospital down in July and started back. And then he said, you know, we've got to refuel before we can go back over the battlefield. And so we went on to Hawk Hill and got ready to refuel it. The crew chief got out. He's the guy who's in charge of that. And discovered that about 2 feet of our rotor had been shot off. Well, that really made the airplane unflyable. So we had to get another airplane up, and we did. We went back over the fight and spent the rest of the afternoon just trying to make some progress, and unfortunately we didn't make a whole lot. The NVA were really dug in, and we couldn't get in amongst them to do very much about it. So as it began to get dark, we had to disengage because we had to refuel, rearm, and we couldn't do that where on the line of battle because we didn't have any fuel up there. So we pulled the troops back, and Lawrence and I sat down and met with the troop commanders and tried to work out what we were going to do on the next day. B Troop hadn't been engaged in the first day of the fight because they were on an operation up to the north of our base camp. So I suggested that we bring them down and try to hit the NVA position basically from the rear, but from their north flank, which would have been their left flank. And that the other 2 troops and the 2 rifle companies continue to attack from the front, that is from east to west. And Lawrence agreed with that. So the next morning, B Troop moved out, and they did hit them in the flank just as we wanted them to. And they busted right through the position. In fact, they wound up in what we all believed later was the regimental headquarters. And the troop commander said that there was commo wire running off from there in all different directions, so we assumed we were sure it was the headquarters. Unfortunately, B Troop found itself surrounded. They had to essentially circle the wagons, and they sat there the entire day having their own little fight, while the rest of the squadron and the two rifle companies continued the attack from east to west. Sometime late morning, it might have been early afternoon, C Troop with its infantry, which was Bravo 4th of the 21st, the infantry got out in front of the cav vehicles and actually got into the NVA lines and found themselves cut off. We couldn't get anybody up there to help them for a bit, and finally one of the ACAVs that happened to have one of our squadron medics on board got into a position where they thought they might be able to get these guys out. Sergeant Swoveland, who was an E5 buck sergeant, was a scout section leader, and Specialist Nussbaumer was a squadron medic, troop medic. They made 2 trips into where these guys were cut off. They brought out a lieutenant who had been shot and one of his men who had also been shot, got them on board the ACAV and got them evacuated. There were still 3 or 4 guys up there, and they'd all been hurt. And Nussbaumer said he was going to go back, and Swoveland said, well, he would go with him. And Swoveland stood up, and he was killed instantly. Nussbaumer got into the area, was shot. He covered the body of one of the other wounded with his body, trying to protect him, and he was killed. There was a sergeant from the 21st Infantry, Nicky Bacon was his name, who was also on the scene. He performed things over the next several minutes that were unbelievable. But he went in and got everybody out. But unfortunately, they were all dead. He got the Medal of Honor. We put Swoveland and Nussbaumer in for the Medal of Honor. But they didn't receive it. They both received the Distinguished Service Cross. But it was one of those examples of what American troops would do. As that episode was coming to an end, it began to rain. We were at the beginning of monsoon season. And it came a rainstorm like I'd never seen before. And we actually had to land the helicopter, and for all intents and purposes, the fight came to a close. You couldn't see anything, couldn't do anything. So everybody sort of stood down for an hour or so. We'd actually landed back behind the C Troop position and just waited it out. When it finally did stop and we got airborne again, and we're calling in airstrikes, and there weren't so many 51 caliber positions now. We'd gotten most of them, we thought, on the first day. Finally, Denny DeWine was our aircraft commander again, said, hey, we got to go refuel. I remember after the first day when he got us out of the mess, he said, well, nobody was supposed to die that day. Well, he landed us back at the hill to refuel and take a stretch. I got out and was walking around where the crew chief was beginning the refueling operation. And he just pointed and he said, look here. And I looked into the refueling tube, and there was a great big hole where a 51 caliber round had gone through, right where the refueling tube married into the fuel tank. So he signaled to the pilot to shut down because we weren't going to be able to refuel. And as the rotor came to a stop, I looked up, and there was a very large hole in the rotor. Then he walked around and looked at it, and he said, you know, if that thing was another inch or so to the right, that whole rotor would have come off. So I guess none of us were supposed to die that day either. We got another aircraft, and I began to think that 123rd Aviation was going to start sending us bills or not send us any more airplanes because we seem to be losing one every day. But we got another one, and we got airborne again, and we went back, and it was pretty much the same as the first day, except that Wayne Lewis and B Troop was still in the middle of the NVA regimental headquarters having the fight of its life. And so we told Wayne, get out of there. So he just pulled out to the south and looped around and came in behind the other two troops. Well, Dick Lawrence and I and Sergeant Major, we landed just a little before dark, I guess, and tried to figure out what it was we wanted to do the next day. And I had the idea that we should just put everybody on line to the south of the NVA positions. The NVA were oriented north to south. And there was a trail that ran on their, would have been their south flank. And I said, let's just line everybody up on that trail and just make a good old-fashioned cavalry sweep right through their positions. And Dick Lawrence agreed with that, so that was the plan. And I said, just for the heck of it, let's have a time on target. We have had a direct support artillery battery, 155, 155 millimeter artillery pieces. We had 6 of them that were in our direct support. They actually lived with us. And I said, let's have a time on target. That would be a great way to wake up the NVA. Now, time on target is a fire mission whereby the artillery, and I don't know how they do this, but they do. They will fire, each tube, each gun will fire 6 rounds. So it's a battery 6 guns. That's 36 155 artillery rounds. But they're fired at different elevation and different charges, so all 36 explode at the same time. So that's what we did. We had a time on target. The next morning we were lined up and we were hovering along behind the line of our vehicles. And that time on, it was really something to behold. I thought it was just absolutely magnificent. Each one of those rounds weighs 100 pounds, so that's 3,600 pounds of high explosive all going off at the same time. It was really something. And then they followed that up with some more prep fires. And when they finished, we moved out, moving north. And except for a few either stragglers or stay-behinds or whatever, the rest of the NVA had gone. So we swept through the position, cleaning up as we went, and then set off in pursuit. B Troop was located better than anyone else to initiate the pursuit. There was a stream that we would have to ford. It was not a shallow thing, and because of all the rain, we'd have to find a place to get across. We knew where there was one ford, and that meant sweeping back a little bit to the east and then looping back to the west. So Wayne Lewis and B Troop started off, and the first thing that happened was they hit a mine in the ford with an ACAV, and it blew stuff all over the place. Well, when you hit a mine, the first thing you do is you get out the mine sweepers and you go around to see if there are any more. And it took about an hour, so we were delayed about an hour really getting started. Everybody else got across after that. We sent B Troop around to the east, or to the west rather, and then hooked south into a likely avenue where we thought the NVA might have gone. C Troop was in the middle and A Troop to the north, to the right. And we advanced all 3 troops with the 2 rifle companies fairly rapidly until we got to where the the lowlands where we always operated began to move up into the mountainous areas, and where we don't go very often. And when we got there, there was some resistance, I guess, where the NVA had reestablished some positions. And Dick Lawrence wanted to get on the ground. So we dropped him off with C Troop. And Sergeant Major Ogas and I continued along in the CNC. And we were down to where B Troop was working its way up into the high ground when one of their tanks took an RPG round right in the turret ring. And it was on the side of the turret ring where the ammunition is stowed in an M48 tank. And it was, the ammunition went off, there was a lot of fire, a lot of explosion. Lieutenant Ed Brown, who was the platoon leader of B Troop 2nd Platoon, was the tank commander in that tank. He was killed. The other 3 crewmen were all hurt, but they all managed to get out. So we had to call a CNC or dust off in to get those folks out. Meanwhile, Sergeant Major said, well, he should really be with Colonel Lawrence, so I took him back, and he married up with CO. And I was headed back towards Hawk Hill for some reason or another when I came across another B Troop vehicle that had hit a mine, another mine. And they had no way to call dust off. So we landed, and I went over and thought there was a tank there that had stayed with the wounded. And I went over and talked to the tank commander and the Denny, or not, I don't know if it was Denny DeWine that day or not, but anyway, the aircraft commander called in dust off. And while we were waiting, there was a medic with him, and he came up to me and said he had to do a tracheotomy on one of the kids that was wounded. Did I have a knife? And he knew very well I had a knife because he could see it. Carol had given me a really nice buck clasp knife before I left for Vietnam. So I said, sure, I have one. And I gave it to him. I never saw it again. I don't know if he was doing a tracheotomy or he just wanted my knife, but he had it. Anyway, we got the dust off in, and we got out. I went back up to where Lawrence was. He said, see if you can get us some water, because guys are really hurting. They'd been out all day with just their canteens. So I called back to the hill and see if we could get some water from one of the aviation units. And Chinooks, the big helicopters, they wouldn't fly any place that was within 1,000 meters of hostile fire, so they weren't going to do anything for us. And evidently there was nothing else available either. Finally, Fred Filbert, the XO, got a hold of Blue Ghost, our air cav troop, and they took some water out to where Lawrence was. The next day it just all sort of petered out. The NVA was gone. Troops all came back to the hill, and we went through a refit, do pool maintenance, and get everybody in shape again. It was 4 or 5 really hectic days for me. I'd only been to Squadron S3 for 3 weeks when this all started. And in retrospect, I felt that I had missed something on the 23rd of August that I mentioned earlier, when that first 51 caliber machine gun took our guys under fire for no apparent reason. And it didn't occur to me then that they didn't want our guys going where they were headed. And they should have figured that out. The whole thing, years later, I was talking with a friend who happened to be in the USARV, the U.S. Army Vietnam Intelligence Section, and he was responsible for threat assessment at that time. And they had forecast at the USARV headquarters that there was going to be a large attack on Tam Key, the province headquarters. But nobody ever told us that. We figured finally that Tam Key must have known something was going to happen too, because they asked for us to send our platoon out with their guys on the morning of the 24th, which normally they did not do. So we think they had some intelligence, but they didn't share it with us either. So we were kind of caught flat-footed, but in spite of that, I think we did pretty well. There's one other thing that has always bothered me about that was body count. That was the score-keeping method, and we claimed that we killed some 450, 500 NVA in those 5 days. I have no idea whether that was true or not. In fact, I didn't even want to report anything because people were saying that claiming body kills and so on all day long, and we had airplanes flying and artillery flying and all the rest of that. And I don't know how many people we killed. And it would seem just a silly thing to send in a number as if it made any difference. The only thing that made any difference was, did we win or did we not? And we ran them off, but I don't know what the real body count was. Well, that was the 27th of August when that fight ended, and the next 10 days or so were fairly quiet, normal patrols, trying to find somebody that wanted to fight, and we couldn't find anyone. On the 12th of September, Dick Lawrence and I had finished supper and we were going back to the CP area, and we got a call that General Geddes was due in. In fact, he was almost there. So he landed, and we all got together in the command post vehicles, and he said, Province Chief in Quang Ngai just had been in touch with him that day, and he was concerned, he was sure that the 3rd NVA Division was going to attack his province capital, which was Quang Ngai City, which was about 75 kilometers south of where we were. And the province chief down there was demanding that we come down and protect him. Now, he was situated in the 11th Infantry Brigade's area of operations, but he didn't want those infantry coming up to protect him. He wanted a cav. So General Geddes said, go to Quang Ngai. And now it's about probably 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening. So Colonel Lawrence got Major Filbert, the XO, and said, get everybody ready to go, get them on the road. Logan and I are going down to Quang Ngai. And we flew down there and met with the province chief, and he was all nervous and nervous. He was sure that he was going to be attacked and his city was going to be overrun and captured, and he was probably going to be killed. So we told him, don't worry, we're on the way. And Dick stayed with him, Dick Lawrence stayed with him for a little while, and I went out looking for a place for us to set up west of the city. And I found a place that looked pretty good. It was an old cemetery. And I came back and picked up Colonel Lawrence, and we started flying back up the road to where the squadron was traveling south. And everybody was upset. Troop commanders were upset, not because they were on the road, but because in their infinite wisdom, the communications security people had changed our signal operating instructions that afternoon. Signal operating instructions, or SOI, is the call signs, the frequencies that you use when communicating with each other. And they had this wonderful habit of making up call signs that were multi-word, multi-syllable, with crazy numbers behind them. Traditionally, in the Army, the commander is always 6. The 3 is always 3. So a troop commander would be Alpha 6, and the squadron commander would be, 6. Anyway, it's very difficult to change your call signs in midstream, and everybody was confused. So Dick Lawrence said, well, look, just make up your own call sign. I'll be Hawk 6, because we were the Black Hawks. And everyone made up a call sign, and we went merrily on our way, and everybody was happy. We finally closed everybody in about midnight that night. It was going on probably 1 o'clock in the morning, the 13th of September, which happened to be a Friday. We got the troop commanders assembled and said, here's the situation. The ARVN has a regiment over here to the southwest in the high ground. So that's a blocking position. We think the NVA are out here to the west and slightly to the north of west. So what we want to do in the morning is 2 troops on this side. There's a river that runs parallel to where we were back into the hills, running east, actually west to east. We're going to put 2 troops south of the river on line and B troop north of the river. And what we want B troop to do is to move along the river as far as he can and then establish a position up there. And A and C troops are going to try to drive these guys to the north and west where they would cross the river into the B troop position. So that's what we did. The next morning, about 6 o'clock, we got everybody on the road, and it didn't take very long to where we were in a good fight. But the 3rd NVA was not the same caliber troops as the 2nd NVA were. They fought hard for about an hour and a half, and then they started falling back. And we were doing exactly what we had set out to do. We were pushing them north and west towards that river. Lawrence and I are up doing what we normally did. We didn't have any air support at all. I guess we had a little bit of Blue Ghost, but our FACs, our Air Force guys, were still operating up north. They didn't come down to join us, so we had no close air support. We had no artillery. But nonetheless, we're flying the racetrack around what's going on the ground. And we're about to make a turn. We're flying like south to north. We're about to make a turn to come back around. And I don't know what Dick Lawrence was looking at, but I was just kind of looking out into space. And I see these parallel lines of like fireballs passing right under my feet, more or less. And I said, look at that. It was scary. It was a twin 51 caliber machine gun that was firing at us, and it was just slightly low in his aim, and the bullets were passing right underneath. Dick Lawrence slapped Denny DeWine in the head. He always said facing out, and I said facing forward. So he just reached up and hit the AC in the head and said, look at that. And Denny went into some gyrations with a helicopter, which I don't think it was ever designed to take, and it was probably as scary as the 51 caliber rounds. The crew chief, who sits on the other side of the helicopter from where we were and has a machine gun, had been firing this whole time. And he either got the NVA position or they ran out of ammunition. Regardless, the firing stopped. We continued in contact, and we were doing pretty well. We got them pushed back as far as the riverbank, actually, before nightfall, and continued the next day, but they had moved on back into the high ground again, so it sort of petered out. So we figured, well, we've saved Quang Ngai, and we're going to go back home. And Dick Lawrence called the CG and said, well, it's over here. We got nothing more to do. So he said, well, come on back, going back to Hawk Hill. And we started out the next morning, actually. And somewhere on the road north of Quang Ngai, Dick Lawrence had this wonderful idea. He called General Geddes and said, look, these guys have had two really good fights in the last 3 or 4 weeks. How about if we just pull off south of Chu Lai on the beach there, and we'll perform maintenance and have a picnic or something, and then we'll go on back up to Hawk Hill the next day. And Geddes agreed with that. So that's what we did. And the beaches there are just beautiful. So we got the whole squadron off right by the South China Sea. Everybody performed their maintenance. We all went swimming. Fred Filbert somehow or another managed to get steaks and beer and barbecue and all the rest of that, and we had a nice cookout on the beach. And there was an Australian show at the AmeriCal Division Combat Center that night. Well, the Combat Center was just off the beach up from where we were located. So we all decided to go to the show. And all the troops walked up, but most of the officers, me included, climbed on top of an armored vehicle launch bridge, an AVLB. Now that's a tank chassis that has a 60-foot scissor bridge on top of it. But the scissor bridge is folded up, so there's two pieces, each about 4 feet high. So you have a tank chassis with about 8 feet of bridge on top of it, along with all hydraulics. So it's a very tall vehicle. We all got up on top of the bridges and we went up and enjoyed the show. We had a lot of beer, and we had a lot of red and green star clusters. And as the show was winding up and the beer was running out, we got the star clusters going out. A star cluster is like a fireworks that you can hold in your hand, and you hit down on the palm of your hand with it, and it fires a star cluster. Well, we got carried away with those, and it seems that we set the AmeriCal Combat Center on fire. At least that's what we were told. Well, the fire got put out. The next morning we went back to Hawk Hill. And about 3 or 4 days later, we got this nasty message from division headquarters that we had had something like 430 communication security violations during that period because we had been using the wrong call signs. And I took that over and showed it to Colonel Lawrence, and I said, what do you want me to do with this? And he said, well, you answer it. So I sat down and wrote a short note back to the division headquarters. I said, we made a 75-kilometer road march at night. We fought the 3rd NVA Division. We killed about 150 of them. We saved Quang Ngai, and we had a hell of a picnic. And I sent it. And we never heard another word. So that was the 12th and 13th and 14th of September. And again, things kind of calmed down. 2 weeks later, 24th of September, the 198th Infantry Brigade, which was the unit just directly south of us, got into something, again, west of Tam Key, a little bit further south from where we had been in August, but evidently just as big. So what the division asked us to do, told us to do, was to support the 198th, which meant sending our troops to, rather than them sending their guys to support us, we divided our troops to support them, which was a very, it was a mess. We had guys going in all directions. We weren't really in control, and it was raining like hell. We had tanks that were up to their sponsons, that's their fenders, in mud, stuck in mud, still firing, but unable to move. And it was really a mess. That was the 24th. On the 25th, it had stopped raining. And we were out over A Troop, who was oriented north or south to north to south, that is. And they were in support of one of the 198th Brigade infantry companies. And so we were flying over. That was Bob Kaiser's troop. We were flying over the troop, and we saw Kaiser's ACAV pull up and stop. And just as he stopped, he was hit with an RPG. Actually, he wasn't hit. The RPG went over his ACAV and hit a tree that was right next to where he was, and he was wounded pretty badly. So we said, no, we're not going to wait on dust off for Kaiser. We're going to go get him. And just as we made that decision, Colonel Lawrence made that decision, our FAC came up on the net and said, hey, I got 2 F4s with iron bombs. Do you have a target for me? And we said, yeah, as a matter of fact, we do. We're going to go down here and pick up a guy, and the enemy position is just ahead of him, a couple of 100 meters. Can you put it down there? And the guy said, sure, we can do that. So we started down. Then as we're about to approach, there are explosions all over the place. They said, that's not an iron bomb. It was a cluster bomb unit. They had made a mistake, and they're not supposed to drop those by friendly troops. Cluster bomb unit is a large bomb that has hundreds of smaller little bomblets inside, and at some point when it gets down close to the impact, it opens up and spreads those things all over creation. Well, I guess it worked out all right, because we got Bob in the airplane and got him out of there and back to our medics, and he recovered. He had a bad wound in his shoulder, but he was out of action for about 2 or 3 weeks. When he came back, I asked Dick Lawrence if he could be my assistant S3 rather than going back to the field. Bob had been wounded. That was the 4th time he had been wounded. So he became my assistant. That whole fight, the end of September, was just not organized, not the way we liked it. We didn't even keep very many records of it. The 198th said they did a heck of a job, and they needed the credit, so we didn't even bother with it. September, October, Dick Lawrence was alerted that he was going to go down and become the Division G3, and he said, well, he had planned to take R&R in November. I'd been in country 10 months at that time. And he said, if you want to go on R&R, you need to go now, because I'm going to go, and then you're going to have to stay here when we get a new squadron commander. So I signed up to go on R&R to Australia, which I did, and I had a good time. But while I was gone, the Tam Kee province chief had arranged for an awards ceremony for Colonel Lawrence, Major Filbert, and myself. We were going to be given a medal by the government of Vietnam, the 3 of us were. And some high muckety-muck was going to make that presentation. And the proviso was that if you didn't show up for the award, you didn't get it. Well, I was in Australia. My operations sergeant, Ron Dews, who was about the same size, actually a little bigger than me, volunteered to be me in order that I would get the medal. So he went down with Lawrence and Filbert on that day, and he had one of my fatigue jackets and my helmet. And he was Major Logan for the day. And that's the medal there. It's called the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Palm. The rest of October was very slow until the end, the last week, the 24th, and the province chief of Quang Ngai got all nervous again. Oh, they're coming back, send the cav again. Well, we didn't want to go, but we did. We went back down to Quang Nai and set up in the same place we had set up before. And we were told that General Ralph Haines, who was four-star general commanding the United States Army Pacific, was going to visit us on the 24th. Well, we were getting ready to brief the general, and we just happened to look out that same river I mentioned earlier, the first time we were down there. We looked out and saw one of Blue Ghost light observation helicopters out circling around over the river out there. And then all of a sudden he wasn't circling around, he was crashing. And it was the troop commander. He had been shot down. So Dick Lawrence said, I'm going to go get him. And he got two of our headquarters tracks and the sergeant major and a couple of squads of troops and took off to rescue the troop commander, leaving me to brief the four-star general. Well, Ralph Haines showed up, and it was sort of like old home week because he had been the division commander of the 1st Armored Division when we were at Fort Hood in 1962-63. And I told him about that. And so he was very friendly, very generous with us. And the reason he had come to see us was he wanted us to know how it was that the 1st Squadron, 1st Cavalry, 1st Regiment of Dragoons had wound up in Vietnam. Because we didn't belong to the division that we were attached to. We were part of the 1st Armored Division. And he said he's the one who made it happen. First, because our squadron was, and it still is, the Army's most battle-honored unit. The squadron had participated in more campaigns than any other unit in the United States Army. And he was afraid that given the time that Vietnam was going on, that some of the old infantry regiments might be in danger of catching us. So he wanted to be sure that the squadron remained the Army's most battle-honored unit, and that's why we went to Vietnam. And he also attached us to the AmeriCal rather than assigning us to the AmeriCal so we could wear the 1st Armored Division patch on our right shoulder when we went home to show that the 1st Armored Division had been engaged in the Vietnam War. I thought that was pretty nice of him. Anyway, he stayed with us for a couple of hours. Dick Lawrence never got back before the general left. And we couldn't find any in VIII to fight. But we had two new troop commanders, Kaiser's replacement, a fellow named Roy Shackelford, and Wayne Lewis had gone as well, so McCartney, Captain McCartney was his replacement. We thought it would be a good idea to let them go out and shake down their troops, get used to it. So that's what they were doing that afternoon. And we got a report back on the radio that we're taking fire, we're taking fire. Both of them were. So we said, oh, okay, let's go see. We hopped in the helicopter and flew out to where they were, which was a ways out west. And A Troop was on the west side of an island. B Troop was on the east side of the island, and they were shooting at each other. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, except their feelings, I guess. There was some embarrassment, but it was a good exercise. They learned a little bit how to maneuver their troops and figure out where they were and where everybody else were in that. The next day, the 25th of October, I guess it was, we got a call from our log support people who were back at Fat City, which was a base camp just north of where the division headquarters are. That division was not able to contact us. And they were relaying through our log support net. And Division wanted us to move our command post so that they could make contact. And we'd had good contact with them when we were down there in September, so we didn't know what the problem was. Anyway, I went and told Colonel Lawrence, I said, Division wants us to move. And he said, why? And I said, because they can't contact us by radio. And he said to me, in all seriousness, he said, you go tell them that it's higher's responsibility to establish contact with lower. Move your command post. So I did. And the last transmission we got from Division Headquarters was, you are logged out of this net. They didn't want to talk to us anymore, which was fine. We stayed the rest of that day and we went back home, and like a fool, I decided I was going to ride my ACAV back rather than taking the helicopter, which was a long, bumpy ride. And we got just to the river south of chVII. There are a lot of rivers that run east to west there. Anyway, we got to that bridge, and we had crossed it 3 times in the last 2 months, but we didn't cross it the 4th time because the tank and an armored vehicle launch bridge, no, it wasn't a bridge, it was a recovery vehicle, managed to crash that bridge into the river. So I was stuck south of the river and wanted to go north. Colonel Lawrence sent the helicopter back for me and took me home. But we did get a bill from Division for the bridge. That was October. November was rather quiet. We couldn't find anybody. We would go out every day looking for a fight, and nobody wanted to trouble with us. We did run an exercise with the Marines in November, and they were going to land at a place just south of Hoi An, which was north of our base camp. And we sent B Troop, a reinforced troop, I guess, up to sit across from where the Marines were going to land in the event that they did make contact, and we would act sort of as a blocking force. I sent one of my liaison officers, Lieutenant Henry Suzak, out to perform that mission with the Marine Command Group. And for reasons I'm not really sure, but I think it was because General Geddes, late in the day, said that he wanted to meet Colonel Lawrence and the Marine Commander at the Marine Commander's command post that afternoon. And so Lawrence told me there was no point in me going out there. He was on the ground talking with the Marine Commander when Geddes' helicopter could be heard coming in on short final. And about that time, a couple of NVA who happened to be right in the middle of the Marines' command post popped up out of their little spider holes and opened fire. They shot Henry Suzak in the leg, but not before he got some grenades, smoke grenades, to try to wave off the CG's helicopter. Lawrence, seeing that Henry had been shot, attended to his wounds, and then he waved off the helicopter. And I guess the Marines dispatched the NVA that were in the area, but it was kind of emblematic of the Marines in Vietnam. Sloppy work. They had a CP and didn't know that they had NVA in holes in the ground where they had their command post. That was about the only thing exciting that happened in November that I can recall. There may have been others. Christmas, 1968. Christmas ceasefire. There was a show down in Chulai on Christmas Eve, and they asked us if any of us wanted to go. We didn't. But the command post, the 196th Brigade command post, was up north of us, and they had a couple of Chinook loads that went down. And on the way back, it was late at night, but their Chinooks were flying over our fire base over Hawk Hill. And some of the guys who still remembered that they wouldn't bring water to us unloaded a couple of M16 magazines in the direction of the Chinooks, just to show them that we didn't care very much for them. There wasn't any harm done. Christmas Day, Bob Kaiser and I were sitting in our little officers club, probably drinking a beer in the morning, when our maintenance tech, Mr. chVII, came in. chVII was a Cajun, actually. His name was Chevalier or something like that, so we called him Mr. chVII. But anyway, he told me that it was his tradition to go hunting on Christmas Day, and he had gotten a new gun. Could he go outside the fire base and go hunting? And I told him I didn't think that was a good idea. He better not go out the fire base. Well, he went. And about an hour or two later, the MPs brought him back. He had taken an M79 grenade launcher, which is a 40 millimeter grenade. And he'd gone off and he'd killed some farmer's water buffalo. And he was under arrest. Well, the MPs turned him over to us, and we took up a collection, paid for the water buffalo, and the incident was forgotten. There was one other thing. I needed to go back, and this would have been late November, after Dick Lawrence had left, and the new squadron commander was a guy named Phil Bolte. And Phil Bolte had been the senior province advisor at Tam Key when we had that big fight. Anyway, he was the new squadron commander, and when he came up, we had him figured as kind of a hearts and minds guy. And the CAV was not hearts and minds. We were usually referred to at division headquarters as slaughter on call. But Phil had his way of doing things. And we had been engaged in something like the Phoenix program for about a month, where using intelligence, we would make early morning raids on known targets and either capture or kill senior Viet Cong. And we'd run 2 or 3 of these successfully. And we had one late on in early December. And evidently they knew we were coming, or they were alert, and our guys were helicoptered in, hit the ground, and the bad guys opened fire. We took a couple, 3 casualties and had to withdraw. And like on cue, our FAC came up on the net, said, "Hey, I got a couple F4s coming back from Da Nang with a full load. You got any targets?" And we said, "Darn right we do." This Bob Kaiser and I were in the CP. "Darn right we do. We have the 6-digit coordinates, and it's a known enemy location. We took fire. We've got casualties. Go get them." Well, the landline rang, and it was Phil Bolte calling from his hooch. And he said, "No, cancel that." And we said, "Why?" He said, "Cancel it." I said, "Look, it's a known location. We've taken fire. We've taken casualties." And he said, "Cancel it." So we canceled it. And the FAC said, "Why?" And I couldn't think of a reason. So Bob Kaiser took the microphone and said it was a command decision. So we were pretty upset by that, and Bob and I went off and sulked for a couple of weeks. We hardly speak to Bolte because we thought, well, this isn't going to work. But I guess he eventually came around and did a pretty good job. He was wounded not long after I left, and as it turns out, I worked for him again later on. Anyway, Christmas came and went. I had been looking for a Christmas drop, that is, since I had to leave home on the 1st of January 1968. I thought at least, in fact, I didn't even think I'd still be there at Christmas time, but I was. But I had decided I'm going to go away from this place. I'm not going to spend my last 3 or 4 days wondering whether I'm going to be shot or bombed or something. And I was going to leave early. And we decided to have kind of a party, a going away party, and there were about half a dozen of us went down to chVII. And we went to the Marine Air Group that was located there. They had a show going on. And Doc Albers, our squadron surgeon, was with us. And there were probably 5 or 6 of us all together. And the Marines started picking on Doc for some reason. We didn't know why. He was seated at a table, and we were all off at the bar or someplace, and we came back, and there were a bunch of Marine aviators giving him a hard time. So we got into a bit of a fight with the Marines. And, I mean, there were probably 200 or 300 of them, and there were half a dozen of us. And we beat a retreat out of there. And we had 2 jeeps with a whole bunch of tear gas grenades. So we made a hasty departure and left several tear gas grenades as a going away present for the Marine Corps. We went to our own officers' club, and they said that we couldn't come in because we were disreputable. So we all found a place to sleep and went to bed. The next morning, Doc Albers was going on R&R, and I haven't said very much about him. He had had 14 years private practice before he volunteered to come on active duty, and he volunteered to come to Vietnam. They were going to send him to Germany. He said no, he wanted to come to Vietnam. Well, because he had that much in private practice, he had been promoted to major, but the squadron surgeon slot was captain. He never told anybody he was a major because he didn't want to leave. Well, we were getting ready to go to the airstrip to get the airplane to go down to Cam Bay. And he said, "Can I borrow a pair of major sleeves?" And I said, "Sure." So I found an extra set of major sleeves and gave them to him because I knew when he came back, he was going to take them off and go back to the squadron. And he did. And in fact, I came to find out much later, he had actually been promoted to lieutenant colonel. And he said, well, they can't have 2 colonels in a squadron, so he went down to division headquarters. But he was a terrific guy. Anyway, I stayed at Cam Bay. My plane was supposed to have been in on the 2nd of January to take me home. And it didn't arrive, I guess, until the 4th. And I finally got out of there and flew into Seattle. And it would have been the 5th, I guess. And I got home on the 6th of January. And I guess I'd called Carol to tell her that I was on my way, and my oldest brother Ralph was in Wheaton, Illinois, and he came to the airport. I think it was about 10 degrees below 0 on the 6th of January, and brought me home. So that was Vietnam. I thought at the time I was leaving that, looking back over 1968, that it was going to be a watershed year. The Paris peace talks had begun. Tet had happened. We had done major damage to the NVA, to the Viet Cong. But when I looked around, there wasn't a darn thing that was any different than it was when I got there in January of '68. It was the same mess that we had been in the whole time. I don't think we accomplished a whole lot except get 55,000 kids killed. I had put in a preference statement when I left, before I left Vietnam, asking for ROTC duty. I wanted to go to a college campus atmosphere and hopefully work on a master's degree. But I got a letter from Armor Branch saying they needed people of my experience to be instructors at the armor school. And so I was reassigned to the armor school, except not as an instructor, as a battalion commander. 1st Battalion of the School Brigade, which was the worst job I ever had in the Army. It was not a battalion at all. I had 17 permanent party people, a mess hall, and about 1,000 student officers, most of whom, or about half of them, who had just come back from Vietnam. The other half were pretty sure they were going to Vietnam, so you might imagine there was a bit of an attitude problem. And the reason that I had gotten the job was the previous commander had just been relieved because of shenanigans going on in the mess hall that we were responsible for. Not only did I not like the job, I did not like the idea of going back to Vietnam. And the way things were going, I was pretty sure I would be. And I had decided I'd probably used up most of my allotted luck the first time, and I wasn't really interested in going again. And maybe even most importantly, I had 3 little girls. We had 3 little girls. Colleen, the oldest, thought I lived in a mailbox because she was always going with her mother to drop off letters to me. Had seen most of her life. Kelly, who was born while I was in Korea in August of 1964, and who I didn't see until she was 8 months old. And Kathleen, as I had said earlier, who was born 6 weeks before I left for Vietnam. And I just didn't think I wanted to be away from them or from Carol like that anymore. So I submitted an unqualified resignation. I said, let me out. And I got a nice letter back from the Department of the Army saying, thank you for your interest in military affairs. Reapply in 1 year. You can't get out. But it did get me out of that battalion command job, because my brigade commander said, oh, I don't know. I can't have you battalion commander if you're trying to resign your commission. Like that made any difference. So he put in a lieutenant colonel to be the battalion commander and left me there as the executive officer. Well, the colonel had enough sense to say, you really don't want to be here in this job. I think you ought to go look for a home. And he was right. So, having been in the weapons department at the infantry school for a year and a half earlier, I decided to go over to the weapons department of the armor school and apply for a job. And as luck would have it, they had one. There was a major who had a special project going on. Bob Garrett was his name. But he had just gotten orders to go to West Point as an instructor. But before he could take on that job, he had to complete his master's degree. So he was leaving like tomorrow. And they said, we need you to take over this special project. Which I did, and I had a lot of fun doing it. But because it was a special project, I got interested in research and development. And the weapons department there at Fort Knox in the armor school had a little R&D division. So I got assigned there.